Hi there, welcome to the first episode of the From the Valley Boy podcast, a Charlton Athletic podcast, presented by me, Callum. I wanted to start this first episode by really discussing why this podcast. What is this podcast going to be about? Why should you care? This podcast will be very analytical. I want to focus on data, stats, tactics, formations. I want to focus on going really in depth into what's going on in the pitch in front of us. I'll do pre-game and post-match reports. We'll have conversations, hopefully further down the line with those that are in the know. We'll also be taking a look at the latest news from the club, transfers in, transfers out, really having a look, see if we can read between the lines about what's going on. It's going to be long form, be a lot of just talking, but I'd like to hear from all of you. So as I sort of get the infrastructure into place, I'll make sure within the next couple of episodes to put out there how you can get involved and you can be part of this community. So, are you ready? Looking forward to it? Let's get started. For the first episode, I really want to focus on what's happened in the summer so far. Maybe just like reflection on last season as well. To start, this summer, we found out that Cardiff City were interested in taking our manager Nathan Jones. I thought this would be a really good opportunity for me to talk about Nathan, my perspective, and where I think he's taken us and where I think we're going. Nathan took over the club at a real low point. For most of us, it's the lowest point that we've seen the club, with the exception of the times that we almost went out of business. On the pitch, we had a number of players who simply were not good enough for the level. We weren't paying proper transfer fees for players, and those that we had signed for real money often looked disinterested and often just were not good enough. When Nathan came in, this was following defeats away at Burton Albion and at home to Lincoln City. And I thought we were going to get relegated to the fourth tier for the first time in a very, very long time. We were sat outside the relegation zone, I believe, on goal difference at that point. We had a really tough run-in. And quite frankly, we were so easy to beat. We conceded goals for fun. And we were consistently conceding last-minute equalisers and last-minute winners. We had Terrell Thomas and Michael Hector at the back. Neither of whom were at the standard to be in League One. And I think we can see that now with how their careers have progressed. We had Tanai Watson at right back, and we'll get into him later when we talk about the retained and released list. But a player that was a functional full-back, but no more than that. We had injuries everywhere. We had George Dobson entering the last couple of months of his deal, having held up the shirt of a club in Hungary, and then being called back at the last minute. We'd made some good signings in that January window, as the owners sort of tried to bail us out. But quite frankly, it was all just a bit of a mess. When Nathan came in, he made us difficult to beat. That was his main focus. We weren't particularly exciting to watch. We were defensively okay. I wouldn't quite call us solid. But we had a graft, and we fought, and we battled. But it was something that any of us who are Charlton fans know, that being in League One is not how we want to see Charlton play. Now, Nathan got us out of trouble. He gave us actually a number of really good afternoons and evenings in that sort of run. We went 14 games unbeaten. Yeah, most of them were draws. But we went to Pride Park and beat Derby, which was basically the game that secured safety. We had a really important win at Cheltenham. Again, we didn't look particularly convincing in these games, but we were winning when we needed to. The thing that really struck me about that run-in was when Nathan first came in and we played first, second, and I believe it was third at the time, all in the space of 4 weeks. We didn't lose to any of them. Drew with Portsmouth, drew with Bolton, and a game that was really interesting in that I think all of us thought we'd go up to Bolton and we would end up playing, sitting back, trying to absorb pressure and then hit them on the counter. Instead, we went up and almost man-to-man pressed them, and it really threw Bolton off. And if it hadn't been again for a couple of defensive errors, we easily could have won that afternoon. And then obviously we went and beat Derby in the game that I mentioned before. The question going into the summer was how big are the changes that Nathan was going to make, and would he have the budget to do so? Budget's a very relative term in League One. I think you had Birmingham and Wrexham last season, and that sort of really changed the way we all saw budget. We were never going to spend like Birmingham. We were never going to spend like Wrexham. But what we did was we made a number of really smart signings. Players like Luke Berry, who came in and had a pretty decent season for us. Players like Greg Doherty came in, became captain. And while there were some difficult decisions in terms of the players that we let go, Alfie May, George Dobson probably being the two key ones that most people think of, we made decisions that made us slightly more expensive. We made a decision on the Conor Coventry, George Dobson pivot that hadn't worked for a lot of times in League One in terms of them being actually too much of the same player. We went with Coventry, who's younger, and a player that has experience playing at a higher level. We made the decision to sell Alfie May, and look, getting almost £1 million for a player that's entering his 30s, who's quite small, and who, quite frankly, had fallen out with the manager, was actually pretty good business. I know some fans have talked about the idea that we could have gotten a couple $100,000 out of him, and maybe that's true. But for me, it was good business. It was difficult business, and it didn't feel particularly great at the time. But what Nathan did was he realised that he could go and get players of a similar calibre for a price actually that was cheaper and would fit the budget slightly better. One example of that is obviously Matty Godden, who, it turns out, had offered his services to us. And that was a great signing. You look at giving Tyrese Campbell a contract extension when most of us, I think by that point, were really questioning whether he was good enough to play for us. And he took a massive leap last season. But that main problem being centre-back, but we didn't actually make any new signings under Nathan, but we moved Kane Ramsey inside to play at centre-back. It sort of allowed us to have a team where maybe the cogs weren't all perfect, but it worked well enough together to be very competitive. I think most of us came out of that summer going, I wish we'd spent a bit more money. And no, I haven't forgotten about Gassan Hadme, where we spent seemingly all that Alfie money badly. It must be noted. But when you looked at how much we spent in the summer, it was really on wages. It was players that had come down the division, players that had something to prove, players maybe that had been let go by previous clubs. So you look at Doherty, you look at Berry, players, their clubs went, don't know if you're good enough. We also made some sort of slightly strange decisions. Dan Potts being an example of that, barely played for us and really did nothing in the games that he did play. We made the decision to sign Danny Hilton, which wasn't actually that weird. It was a player-coach deal. It was pretty obvious and actually gave us all a pretty great moment away at Northampton, which I'll get into later. But we started that season very well. We're averaging 2.19 points a game through the first 10 games or so. Went up to Wigan, won on the first day of the season. Beat Leyton Orient, second game of the season. And then beat Bolton. But we weren't particularly expensive. We'd made all these signings, but still really lacked width. We lacked a real focal point in terms of our forward play. And so people like me sat there and thought, you'll get Miles back later, that will help with that. For now, you're just trying to put points on the board. And then it all just seemed to slightly disintegrate. We went away to Reading, lost on two really good goals, but both of which were caused by errors on our end. We lost at Stevenage, got embarrassed, quite frankly, at Bristol Rovers, in which we conceded 3 worldies, but really they could have put 4 or 5 on us, and it wouldn't have been a surprise. But we sort of recovered again. Played Birmingham, really surprised them, gave them their first loss of the season, one of only 2 that they suffered all of the campaign, which also involved a great moment where Kane Ramsey slid into Alfie May to remind him, hey, welcome back. And then it all sort of disintegrated again, and we started dropping points, we started drawing games with teams we shouldn't. And then we had quite possibly one of the worst results in club history, and this is no attack on Crawley. It's a good club. But we lost at home to Crawley on a Tuesday night when they were really, really struggling. Now, I'm going to slightly defend Nathan in this, and that he came out after the game and said, look, we didn't deserve to lose. And we didn't. If you look at the stats in that game, we didn't deserve to lose. If you go and watch the highlights, we had multiple opportunities to win it. And quite frankly, the second goal shouldn't go in, the first is a worldie. But it was a 90th minute goal again that we conceded, and you sat there and you thought, oh my God. And then we went to Lincoln in a horrible, horrible storm. I didn't go, I was ill. But to anyone that made that trip, fair play to you. Neither team that I scored that afternoon. But what followed was a trip to Northampton. And for whatever reason, it just clicked. And it's one of those sorts of games that you remember and sticks with you. Because it was so different to what we've seen before. The ball was on the ground, we stopped doing the long ball thing, we had width, we had pace, we had power. The front two tires, Callum and Miles Lee, were absolutely fantastic that afternoon. And it ended with one of the best moments of the season, which was Danny Hilton scoring against Northampton. He played at Northampton and hadn't scored this entire time. And he ran over to the home fans and started doing the Jude Bellingham celebration. It's one of the great bits of trolling that I've seen all season. Still makes me laugh. And then from there, we just did not look back. We just looked like a brand new football team. We lost 4 games in 23 in the second half of the season. 2 of those, Rotherham, Peterborough, we just didn't show up. And that can happen over the course of a season. In fact, it's going to happen. Birmingham fans make the argument they didn't show up when they came to the Valley. And then we had a loss at Birmingham, which we didn't disgrace ourselves. Maybe it made you question whether we had the sort of forward players to compete in the Championship next year if we were to get promoted. But we didn't disgrace ourselves by any stretch. And then went to Wrexham, we had injuries, we were tired. And quite frankly, Wrexham bled us off the park, right? And they deserved it that afternoon. I've actually not been that angry watching a Charlton side in a while because I felt like we just didn't show up. But as I say, there are some mitigating circumstances there. But by the time we got to the end of the season, following the best away days of the season, you can take your pick between Northampton, Leyton Orient, and Wycombe. We got to the playoffs and we ended up getting Wycombe. Stockport won their game against Wycombe, which meant that they were playing Leyton Orient, and we were able to get Wycombe. Wycombe were on a bit of a downward trend. First game, very boring 0-0, but I think people forget that Godden had a really good opportunity to win it if it wasn't for a really good save from Will Norris. And then we took the second leg at the Valley. What a night. Completely packed. Flags everywhere. Fireworks from the ownership, fair play to them. We had flags. We had a sort of, not quite a tifo. I don't know what you call it when you put the piece of paper over your head to create the sort of CAFC 1905 logo across the covered end. And it was a fantastic night. It was a terrible game of football. Do not get me wrong. It was absolutely awful. But we got the goal and we got the win. And that was kind of a reflection of that first part of the season where we didn't always play very well, but we found ways to win. And then we got Leyton Orient in the playoff final on my birthday. Leyton Orient just down the road from me. They're sort of one of my local clubs along with West Ham. And it's one of those games, again, where it wasn't fluid. We didn't look particularly attacking. We didn't look like we were threatening too much with our attack. But what we did do was we had the one moment, and multiple times across the season, what Nathan Jones has implemented, and it sort of again reflects back to when he first came in, is win the moments. You don't have to win for 90 minutes. You just have to win moments in games of football. And that's what we did at Wembley. And it was a great afternoon. For those of you that joined me in stopping when the final whistle went, it was truly a fantastic afternoon on my birthday. Enjoyed the Green Man before. Atmosphere was excellent. So when Cardiff were interested in Nathan Jones, when you look at that journey, for a lot of us it was concerning. You know, you look at it and you go, you can't really go. Once Nathan Jones kind of takes hold of your football club, it kind of becomes the Nathan Jones show, which has its positives and its drawbacks. But it was pretty clear from the Charlton end that they thought Cardiff aren't going to pay the compensation here. Cardiff, under Vincent Tan, are not going to pay the money. And so most of us were sat there going, I don't think he's going to go, but he can't come out and say, I don't want to go, because he's made it clear that one day he'd like to manage Cardiff. It's his boyhood club. So he can't go and burn bridges. But he sort of rejected them in the only way he could that was fair by signing a new contract extension, which takes him to 2030. And that contract extension is a very long time for a football manager in the modern day. But I'm sure his wages went up. I'm sure the release clause has gone up quite considerably. And I'm sure he got some extra money for the transfer budget. And I don't think any of those are necessarily negative things. I think we've got a championship-proven manager who says some weird stuff. I have to be honest. But when he's your manager, the antics, and you're winning, I should make it clear, the antics can actually be quite fun. And I'm looking forward to having Nathan Jones back in the Championship. I think it's going to be a very exciting time for those of us involved in Charlton. Let's discuss the release from retained list now just quickly. I don't think there was anyone on that list that really surprised anybody. I like Chuck Sneakhead, the player. I think he's a nice bloke if I had the chance to chat to him. But the injury history and the wages he was on, and the fact that actually he wasn't quite as effective this season. He definitely looks as if he lost a yard of pace and maybe lost a step in the jump. But he's a player that was incredibly frustrating because of that injury history, and incredibly frustrating because he couldn't run sometimes. But he's a player that's given us a number of great moments. He's a player that you would see his name on the team sheet and it would get you excited. And we haven't had enough of those at Charlton over the last few seasons. And so I wish Chuck's all the best in that next stage of his career, or if he decides to hang it up, I hope that he looks after his body. Then we had Tanai Watson. That's the only other player that's on that list that you really would think that's more than a youth player. And as I said earlier in the show, I think he's a perfectly acceptable rotational fullback at League One level. And I'm sure he'll get a contract somewhere to play as a rotational fullback. He has some injury concerns, and there are questions over whether a player of that quality is worth the sort of injury headache. But, if you're a team in the bottom half of League One, or maybe sort of mid-table trying to sort of push on, having a squad player like that's never a bad idea. He can play centre-back, not particularly well, I might add, but he can play at centre-back. And he's not slow, he can keep up with most wingers at the League One level. And so, again, there are games where we play next to Michael Hector and Terrell Thomas, and you can't blame anyone for struggling playing next to those two at times. But he's not a great fullback, and moving on to the Championship, you need better quality from your wing-back positions, especially with Nathan expecting to continue with the three at the back system. In terms of the young players that are on that list, I know Harry Kedwell was, Aaron Henry. I know that it's difficult for those players to be released by clubs they've been at most of their lives, if not all of their lives. But I wish them the best of luck in whatever comes next for them. I think that Aaron Henry's actually signed a non-league contract, if I'm not mistaken. But I think ultimately they weren't quite good enough, and they weren't ever going to really make the step up into the first team. But for all those young players that were released, whatever level it was, I wish them all the best moving forward. And now we get to the one player that left that's on that list at the time we said we offered a contract to, and probably one of the biggest disappointments in terms of losses, and that's Thierry Small. Now, I don't think any of us know exactly what went down, whether Preston offered more money, whether Preston offered more years, whether he wanted to go, he's from the Midlands, whether he wanted to go back towards the northern part of the country, a bit easier access to his family. None of us know, and I don't think any of us will ever know. But he was a player that was very, very raw. But for Preston fans that are listening for whatever reason, he can beat a man. He's got a real turn of pace, but the end product is often lacking. Now, that can be taught. It's not impossible. We'll get to a signing that Charlton have made, but that last final bit isn't always perfect. But he's a player that I think most of us who are fans would have liked to have stayed. It's just a question of whether Preston offered him a deal that was too good for him to take, or whether we lowballed him, or whatever it may or may not be. I don't think he's irreplaceable, but I think he's a good player. And I think he's a player that if he continues to develop could be worth a lot of money, and maybe that's something that we'll live to regret. But you don't know why players make the decisions they make. I wish Thierry all the best of luck. I'm not going to be one of those people that piles in of, he was substituted here and he was a bit petulant or whatever. I don't think that's true. I think Thierry was a pretty good professional. I think that he's someone that won the community award, took time out with fans, seemed like a really nice chap, and I wish him all the best of luck at Preston, except for the 2 times we played them this season. Alright, let's talk things that are a little bit more exciting for all of us. I want to start actually with contract extensions. I think that's a really important part of what the ownership are trying to do at Charlton now. Miles Leeburn signed an extension last week. Fantastic news. Absolutely fantastic news. We don't know if there's a release clause in there. We don't know all of the sort of ins and outs of the contract. It doesn't really matter. This is one of the players that we have that I feel really can make that step up if his body will let him. The fact we're giving him a 3-year contract makes you think probably the club think that they can keep him fit. But the real thing for Miles is going to be to have this full pre-season this year. The first time he's going to have that since he was a youth player. And really focus on making sure his body is right. He seemed noticeably happier over the last 6 months or so. I can't tell you why. It might just be his demeanour. Some players are a lot more chilled out. Some are a lot more sort of nervous in front of the cameras. But I'm sure part of it is Nathan Jones making it very, very clear that he believes in him. I know when Nathan Jones came in, one of the things he was most excited about was working with the young players. Tyrese and Miles were sort of top of that list. I think Roy was on there as well. So that's really good news. On the same sort of idea, Micah and Bick, 4-year contract. That's really great. That follows up from the youth players signing earlier in the season. So players like Ibrahim Fuller. These are all on long-term contracts now. I'll tell you a really short story. When we played away at Blackpool, I went out with my mates the night before. Woke up the next morning, not feeling at my best, shall we say. I walked out with my Charlton clobber, and who did I run into? Curtis Fleming. And we ended up walking down Blackpool Pier. Really, really nice guy. Really nice guy, Curtis. But we were chatting about sort of how fans feel, ticket prices, all kinds of different things. And he went to me, he was like, I don't quite understand why some fans aren't particularly trusting. I went, look, one of the reasons is that if you look at Ezra Konsa, even Alfie Doughty, Joe Gomez, Joe Rebo, players that went for nothing or cheap, right? Konsa's a really bad example of it. When you look at it, you go, we sold him for 2 million, he went for 12.5, didn't he? 15 million within 12 months. Joe Rebo went for free, right? And you kind of look at the sell-on clause maybe for Gomez sort of softens the blow a little bit. The only player we really got good money for in terms of being a young player in the last sort of 10 years really was Lookman, right? And that's because he was so talented. And I still argue he's the best graduate we've ever had. But he's so talented that he was always going to go for a huge amount of money. It's just unfortunate that Roland decided not to invest that back in the club. But when I was chatting with Curtis, he turned to me and went, but that's not going to happen anymore. Right? And he made it very clear to me that they were closing in on terms with Miles, and I wonder if that may have been promotion dependent. But we're going to hold on to them, or we're going to sell these players at the top of the market. And it's so key for lower league football clubs to sell those players at the top of the market. I don't like talking about football clubs because they're people, as if they're assets. But they are, and it's a business. And 200, 300,000 extra that you can get by a player having an extra couple of months of his contract is massive, right? And so it's one of those things that you look at and you think to yourself, I can see that vision now, right? The manager's locked up long term. Miles is locked up long term. All the kids are locked up long term. First team is mostly on long term contracts if you want to put Lloyd Jones in there, right? Macaulay Gillespie's just signed a contract extension, the hero at Wembley. Macaulay's a really interesting case. I think it's a real show of faith from the football club that he's going to be able to make that step up to the Championship. Now, the real problem for Gillespie is going to be his pace. He turns very slowly. He's a big lad. But I think that you can do things like pinch the left backs in, maybe move Coventry over a little bit just to defend them. I think against Dartford we saw a long ball. We'll come to the Dartford game later. We saw a long ball that he didn't quite catch on to, and the players in behind him. So there are some quote-unquote flaws to McCauley's game. But he had an excellent second half of the season, and I always thought he would come good. He's the sort of player that you heard from Plymouth fans was so good for them for so long that I always thought he's going to be fine. It just needs to take a bit of time. I also thought he got a lot of pelters in the first half of the season that weren't fair. This is no slight on Lloyd Jones, by the way. I like Lloyd Jones. I think Lloyd Jones is an excellent centre-back. But there were times last season where it was like Lloyd is single-handedly keeping clean sheets. Defending's a partnership, or the three-person partnership in terms of a back three. So I think it's important that we don't say that Gillespie was crap for months and months and months and months on end. He wasn't great in the first stint for Jones in that sort of at the end of the 2023-2024 season. But I don't think he was terrible to start the season. I thought he had a good game at Wigan, for example. I think he had a good game against Bolton at home. I think he had a good game against Birmingham at home, right? So I think sometimes the criticism has been a bit over the top. People want someone to blame. And he's got that really big, long kicking motion, which is always the most aesthetically pleasing thing in the world. But I'm really happy for Macca. He scored quite a few goals this season. I think he deserves a contract extension. I think they're making it clear they don't want him to go into the final year. And so I look at it and I go, stability is very much what they're focused on. They're focused on having players here for the long term. They're focused on having players that want to be here. They're focused on having players that want to play for the manager. And then they've made sure that the manager wants to be at the club. So they're the contract extensions. And I think they're all positive. I don't think there's a problem with any of them. You know, beyond maybe a bit of a thought about how Gillespie's pace is going to translate to the Championship. And now the bit that we're all the most excited about. Transfers. We've made 6 signings so far this summer, and we're in mid-July. That's not bad. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through them chronologically. I'm not going to, in this podcast, go through sort of stats and average positions and that sort of thing. Just because there's so many signings that it's going to be difficult to do so. I will do a sort of transfer window roundup podcast at some point where we can sort of maybe get more into that. But for now, I just want to kind of go through my thoughts, sort of initial thoughts on all 6 of these players and kind of go, okay, this is what I think about them signing. And then I want to have a look at the end of this segment about and talk about a player who it looks like we could be signed within the next week or so. He may have been signed by the time you're listening to the podcast. The first player that came in on the same day that Thierry Small left kind of came completely out of nowhere, and that was Sonny Carey from Blackpool. It's an interesting signing, this, mainly because I think that it's quite similar to the latest player that we've signed in Joe Rankin Costello, in that I don't think anyone really knows what his best position is, but you know that he's a good footballer, right? Sonny Carey, I think, will fit behind the 10s. We saw him play there against Dartford, sort of behind the 10s, behind the strikers, sorry. We saw him play there in the game against Dartford. I don't think he was unbelievable, but he did play the 1-2 that ended up setting up the goal. I thought he was quite involved. He's not a terrible tackler. He'll throw himself into things. He had a very good second half of the season at Blackpool, and they fought quite hard to keep him. He's also got 39 games of experience, I think it is, in the Championship, playing for Norwich. And Blackpool, I would imagine. So, he sort of has got some experience. Do I think this is a marquee sign that's going to blow everybody's mind? No. But I think he's a very good squad player. I think he's a player that you'd like to have. I think he'll be battling to get into the first XL. I think that he'll have a lot of games that he'll start. I just think that he's a player that you bring in so you can change things throughout a game rather than him starting week in and week out. The second signing we made was Thomas Kaminski from Luton Town. Luton Town's too much you're going to hear a lot, I think, on this podcast. But this is a fantastic signing. This is one of the best shot stoppers in English football. For £1 million for a goalkeeper who's 32, I don't think it's an egregious transfer fee. You kind of worry about being relegated twice, but the Premier League relegation absolutely wasn't his fault, and there are some Luton fans that will argue that he was actually very good in the Championship again when they were relegated. The real thing at Luton was they didn't have any centre-backs. The centre-backs kept getting injured, and that meant that you didn't have any continuity in front of him, and that just meant they just shipped goal after goal after goal. But Kaminski made a number of really good saves in that Championship season. Kaminski is nothing but a shot stopper. He doesn't particularly command his box well, which will drive me slightly mad, I imagine, over the course of the season. And he's not great at distributing. But I think Nathan Jones thinks we're going to face a lot of shots this season. I think he's right. And Will Mannion is not particularly good at shots from outside the box. We saw that all season. And Ashley Manabrook can't command a box and he can't distribute to a point where when we played Reading at home, they basically pressed the goalkeeper. And it meant that we couldn't get out. So you need a goalkeeper that can at least distribute better than that in order to play in the Championship. Now, Mannion has really great qualities. He's very good at commanding his area. He comes out and catches a lot in the game at Wembley. I thought he was excellent in that second half. But he didn't have a save to make. And over the course of the playoffs, he had one save that I can really think of, which was a save from, I believe it was Udo. Took a shot for Wickham from outside the box. It was a good save, because it sort of veered right in front of Mannion. He had to sort of react. But Mannion's been beaten so often this season from outside the box that is a worry. Kaminski is not just a step up on those two keepers. I think he's a major upgrade. And I think that it's a really, really good bit of business. And I think it's slightly different to the other bits of business we've done with Luton historically and this summer, because Nathan Jones never actually managed him when he was at Luton. So I think this is a slightly different signing. He ended up being available. I think he was supposed to go to Turkey. That seemed to collapse. We swooped in and bought him. And I think that was a really, really good bit of business. We were trying to get a goalkeeper all last summer. So it's not a surprise. But the question for me is, are we going to just hold on to all three of them? Is Mannion okay being a backup? By the sounds of things, Maynard Bird tends to stay and fight for a place. I mean, I can't see what he'd be fighting for other than backup, but he's going to stay and fight. The question is, will Mannion do the same? And we'll find out. But in terms of just a pure signing, I think Kaminski is an excellent, excellent bit of business from the football club. Isaac Oluwafe from Stockport. This is a really interesting one. It's one that, again, once I've got the infrastructure set up, I'll try and get some fans involved in. But $1.5 million to me felt steep. And I don't mean steep as in we've been ripped off. I just mean that price seems high for a player that's not got a great finishing record. He had a good season, I believe it was, with Sutton United in either the National League or League Two. And he had a good season for Stockport League Two as well. But he's just the sort of player I look at and I go, he's got everything except for that final finish. He's absolutely rapid. He's a big lad. He's athletic. He's strong. He can beat a man. But his finishing is not the gold standard of Championship strikers, shall we say. And you do worry about a player that didn't hit double figures in League One and played almost every game, about whether he can make that step up to a division in which the top scorer had, 17 goals last year? There was no 20-goal scorer in the Championship last year. It's hard to score. You can't miss chances, especially for us when we're probably going to be in the bottom half of the table. So it's a good question. I think he's a very good player. I just look at it and I go, Stockport then went out and signed Malik Motherslil from Peterborough for basically half that cost. And you go, I believe Oluwafe is a better player right now than Motherslil is. And I know Motherslil, there's been questions about his attitude. There have been questions about the way he carries himself, and sometimes maybe his in-game sort of petulance. But he's a very good prospect. And I look at that and I go, is Isaac Oluwafe worth £700,000 more than the Mothers? I'm not sure. But it'd be interesting to find out what other people's perspective on it are. All right, 2 centre-backs from Luton Town followed Isaac Oluwafe through the door. First is Murray Bell, left-sided centre-back, can play at left wing-back. Has clearly lost a step after a couple of injuries, and supposedly has a history of switching off at the back post, which any Charlton fan will give you PTSD of Sean Clare playing fullback. But he's a squad player. I'd be surprised if Bell plays more than 15, 20 games, maybe 25 with substitute appearances. And I think he probably knows that. He's coming in to be a dressing room presence. He'll play some games. He'll probably play most of the cup games. He'll bring experience with him. But in many ways, he's there because he knows the system. And if something was to happen to McCauley, you need a left-footed centre-back. And he is one, right? And they're hard to find. Left-footed centre-backs are really difficult to find, especially good quality ones. And because they're hard to find, they're often really expensive. The price we paid for Gillespie when he was coming off an injury was really quite high, considering Plymouth's own thoughts about his suitability to step up to the Championship. So I look at Bell and I go, look, it's a cheap way to get a left-footed centre-back in. It's someone that knows Nathan's system, that wants to go and play for Nathan again. And I don't really have a problem with it. I don't think it's a particularly sexy signing. I don't think it's one that gets the blood pumping. But I think it's quite a functional signing. I almost feel the opposite with Reece Burke. To me, if all the centre-backs fit, this is going to sound blasphemous because I'm a big Kane Ramsey fan, I'm a big Lloyd Jones fan, big Gillespie fan. Reece Burke's the best centre-back at the club if he's fit. And I don't think it's much of an argument. Right? This is a guy that's excellent in the Premier League. He's got all the quality to be a Premier League centre-back. He's relatively quick. He's good on the ball. He's strong. He's agile. But he's injury-prone as anything. And you look at it and you go, can you get 25 games out of him? And if you can, who comes out of that back five? And that's going to be the question with Burke. I don't think it's anything to do with the quality. I think he's going to be absolutely brilliant in the games that he plays. But how many games is he going to play? And that's the question. The final signing that we've confirmed at the time of recording this podcast, Joe Rankin Costello from Blackburn Rovers. This has been reported about 750 grand. I think he's a strange signing in a way. I think it's a positive signing, but it's a strange signing. Because he's really similar to Carey, as I said, in terms of no one really knows what his best position is at times. There's a guy that played fullback and had 7 shots on target in a game, right? Technically, he's very good. He's a good dressing room guy, right? That's what you hear from Blackburn fans. Some weeks he looks like a world beast. He was really excellent. I think it was under Dal Thomason. He played right back. But we don't play a traditional back four. We play a back five. Is he a wing back? I don't know. I think he's been brought in to compete with Ray Doherty in central midfield. And he's a more technical player than Doherty is. And he's actually got quite a good shot on him. But he's not really a centre midfielder in a classic sense. And so is it a risk bringing a player in that mostly played at right back and playing him at centre mid? I'm not sure. I think the thing that's really exciting about it is he's 25 and signed a 4-year contract. So both him and Carey are here through their prime years. And I think that the thing about those sorts of players is if you're a good player, even if I can't find your perfect position, if you're a good player, I can make it work. And that's really what Nathan has to do, I think, with those two players, is either find their right position, and for Carey it sounds slightly as if it's playing off that left side, cutting in, playing off that right side, cutting in. For Costello, the question is he a midfielder, is he a right back? Now, when Nathan was asked, he seemed to talk about him as a midfielder, so that's why I say he probably competes with Doherty. But is he a centre midfielder? And that's the question that I have. Not about the quality of the player. I think the player is a very good player. And I believe he's absolutely championship quality. He should be. He's never played below that level. And I think it's quite exciting that he himself has said, look, I want a new challenge. I want to come down south. He spent all his life in the northwest. I want to try something different. And I think that's always a commendable thing for a player. So, before we go, I just wanted to have a quick reflection on the game at Dartford. Not because I think you should read very much into it. There's a lot of kids that played. It was very, very hot. It wasn't particularly exciting as a spectacle. But there were a couple of things that stood out to me. I'm not going to worry about the defending in the first half. I don't think that's going to be a problem when we get into the regular season. Right? I don't think I'm going to worry about one ball over the top. I'm not going to worry about really bizarre refereeing decisions on penalties given. I'm not going to worry about skirmishes in the box. I think ultimately, once we get to the regular season, it will be fine. But there were a couple of things that really impressed me. The first was actually Daniel Carney. I thought he looked pretty good, and I mean in terms of hold-up play. It was a good finish, the goal that he scored, and it's good for his confidence, and it looks likely that he'll be going to Wimbledon on loan. I think that makes lots of sense. Go to Jacko. I think that he'll have his support network in London. He won't really have to move. I think it'd be really good for him to get sort of week in, week out League One experience without what he's had sort of with ours, where he's sort of been in and out of the squad at times. I think that Micah and Bick also impressed me. Almost for something completely different. The fact that he played that morning for the under-21s and then showed up for the first team, pops up, first touch goal. He looks bigger, he looks stronger, he looks like really kind of a bit like a baby Anike in a way. He's got a really good finish on him. I think that we've seen that. The goal against Cray Valley, the goal against Dartford yesterday. Now, again, they're both non-league sides. But he really impressed me again in terms of that knowing where to go, that front post run. That's something you can't really teach a striker. You've just got to know where to go. And the finish was good to hook it up over the goalkeeper. And then there are a couple of other players that really impressed me. So Ibrahim Fuller, who I think is going to be a really excellent player. I do wonder whether a loan for him would make sense. It would need to be a club that's playing full time. I don't know if they're going to loan players to the National League. It might be League 2, and I don't know if he's quite at the level where a League 2 club would take him right now. But I think they could have a look and see if a League 2 side would take him. I think technically he's definitely there. I think he's just physically needs a bit more time to develop. He's only 18 years old. That's not it's not a slight on him. And then Al Mwamba, I thought played really, really well. I think that he was sort of hampered by the fact that he was playing in one of those 2-8 roles, and he's not tall enough to play there. He's definitely a 10, so he couldn't quite win some headers, but I thought it looked good. I think he looked tidy on the ball. He came for the ball, he called for the ball, and I think that between him and Fuller, I think that was a really impressive performance. And then you had Kai Ensign at left back, who I thought, again, a couple of good balls into the box. You can see what he brings. It wouldn't surprise me if they hold on to Ensign. I think he's probably of those very young players, and we'll get into another younger player in a minute, but of those very young players, he's technically there, and physically he looks big enough. So you could have him as an emergency left wing back option. And I think that's actually quite important for the club to have someone that's training week in, week out, and actually can play on both sides. So I think, and I've heard he's actually got a very good right foot as well as a left one. So he could be a really good sort of utility player just to have in and around the first team in the training sessions. And we'll go from there. And I think that will depend sort of on the business that we do for the rest of the window. I think the two players that really impressed me, actually, outside of Reece Burke, I thought was excellent. That was Zach Mitchell, who I still look at and think he isn't quite big enough to play centre-back in the Championship. But if he adds a little bit to that frame, he is technically so good. You know, able to spin out, spin round. He's dogged in the tackle. He's calm. He can play on the left side of the defence, the right side of the defence, the middle of the defence. I think there's a really, really exciting talent in there. But it's just a question of finding the right place for him. I think sometimes people get a bit confused. Centre-backs take a little bit longer to develop. Them and goalkeepers, right? So I look at him and I'm like, look, even if he goes on, like, he's 20 years old, right? He turns 21 at the end of this loan. For a lot of positions, yeah, that's that's older, quote unquote. But not for a centre-back. Some centre-backs don't come through till they're 23, 24. Because you have to know where to be. So mainly what you're trying to do with a centre-back when you send them out on loan is to try and send them somewhere where they can sort of buff up, toughen up, get bigger, get stronger. And so for me, what impressed me about Zach was in a game against non-league attackers, he looked classy. He looked almost a level above, and I thought that was a very exciting thing for a player that I think still probably needs to add a little bit of muscle to the frame. And then finally, the player that actually most impressed me, and this is probably not going to make me too many friends in the Charlton community at times, but Cry Anderson, his first touch all game was exceptional. And this is the bit of the game that Croy has been missing, is that technical on-the-ball ability. I never think he's going to be a great passer of the ball. He's never going to have that ability to do the Coventry sort of weighted ball, where it's kind of just in front of a player, or just behind a player, or just next to a player. But what Croy can do is take the ball and drive. And I think that that's where Nathan is trying to take us, is away from a long ball sort of squad, to a squad where players can drive. If you look at the players that we have, Ken Ramsey can drive. Lloyd Jones can drive. Joe Rankin Costello can drive. Carey can drive. Coventry can sort of drive. Hopefully he doesn't take a shot from outside the box. Doherty can drive. Edwards definitely can drive. And you look at it, and all of a sudden you've got that option now to create an angle and allow players to drive forward into space. And that's what Anderson needs, to be able to take the ball down and drive. And if you can add that to his game, all of a sudden, he's got the tackling ability. He's actually got the strength off the ball. On the ball's a bit different, but he's got the strength off the ball. So the question for me with Croy is, technically, can you get to the point where you can take the ball down and drive? Against Dartford, I think he did it on multiple occasions. Took the ball down, drove forward. And it's going to be more difficult when you're being pressed higher, and I understand that. But my expectation will be that Croy will play 30, 35 games this year. You might not start many of them, but when you're 1-0 up, a player that comes on and just is a bit of a pain in the backside for the opponent, that's helpful. But he's a full-time international for a nation that's not terrible in Jamaica. I would expect them to qualify for a World Cup over the next 8 years or so. So I look at Croy, and I think that there's a heck of a lot of money that can be saved by not having to sign a midfielder of good quality there. It's just up to Croy to kind of make that decision to be that player. Before we go, I'm going to spend 2 or 3 minutes on a player that sounds like we're moving in for, and that's Rob Apter from Blackpool. Some Blackpool fans don't think he can move to right wing back. Some say he's not quite there yet in terms of Championship development. I think Nathan Jones would sit there and think, I can get him there. Was it 8 goals? Was it 8 goal involvements, I think, last season for Blackpool? So, not the most prolific player in the world, but very, very quick. He can beat a man. He's got a decent final ball. Does it sound like anyone else we talked about earlier in the podcast? Because that sounds like Thierry Small to me. And so I think that in League One, it was okay to leave Ramsey on an island because he could deal with 2 players. Because Kane Ramsey played League One at times like he was on autopilot. He can't do that in the Championship, and if he can do it in the Championship, he's moving to the Premier League in January. But actually, in Rankin Costello, in Ramsey, you've actually got players that can play that right back position, especially if Burke is fit to start the season. You could put Ramsey at full back. Having a player like Apter who can come into a game or start a game and just be really dangerous, I think is a really good thing. I think he's also a player that the club probably thinks, look, if we sign him for 1.5, 2 million quid, we'll probably can sell him for 5 or 6 later on. And I think that's a good way to start looking. Once you get to the Championship, you can start sort of thinking in those sorts of terms of longer term we can sell it. I think it's pretty obvious that the 10 million or so that the club got for going up to the Championship is basically going to be the budget, which leaves you basically the space to either sign 2.5 million players, and the ones that are obviously being linked to are Apter and Callum, that would complete the squad. Or you can sign one for 2.5 million and two for 1.5 million or whatever it is. But I think the way that they're building this squad, Nathan, Phil, and I think Rodwell is pretty clear, is the other. It's actually the right way to build a championship squad in mid-July. Right? We've got depth in most positions. I still think we need someone at CDM to back up Coventry. And we probably need another right back. But if you bring Apter in, if you can bring in another 10, especially with the squad size going up, I think all of a sudden you have a really, really exciting squad that's got some experience, yeah. And especially in the sort of anchor position, so you're sort of your backbone, your goalkeeper, your centre-backs, some of your midfielders are very, very experienced. And then you've got Matty Gordon up front as well. But actually you've got youth, athleticism, power, right? And that's something that Nathan Jones really likes. And so I think what we're seeing is them building a squad for this manager. And that's really, really exciting for us as fans. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for tuning in to the From the Valley Floyd podcast. My name is Callum. I'll see you again next time.